Great questions. Thank you. So the example that I gave and the relationship between theory of mind and morality. The first part of this question was, did I do a bait and switch, starting with simple false belief tasks where the question is where somebody will look for their sandwich, to a question about whether somebody deserves blame for putting powder in a cup of coffee. In those experiments, I think actually I was asking pretty much the same question all along, which is, in making a simple judgment about action, can you take into consideration a false belief? And in some ways, that's the paradigm question for all of theory of mind. So although I switched what question, so sometimes the question is, what do you predict they'll do? Sometimes the question is, can you explain what they did? And other times the question is, how do you feel about what they did? It's different questions always about the same thing, which is, when they did that action, were they guided in part by a false belief about a matter of fact, right? The false belief is about where their sandwich is, or which sandwich is theirs, or which cookie is theirs, or what powder this really is, or whether this is a functioning parachute, right? It's always a matter of fact, and the question is, did the person have a true belief or a justified false belief? I only talked about justified false beliefs and the role that plays. And so those mistakes, you can think of them as mistakes of fact, then have consequences in our predictions, explanations, and evaluations of action. The next question is much harder, which is, what's the boundary of theory of mind? And so that's a crazy hard question. It's not even clear what discipline that question is in, because you start asking, well, what do you mean, the thing, theory of mind? So you could be asking, for a community of scientists who are using this as a term of art, what do they mean? And the answer is, there's no community of scientists, and therefore no agreement. Each person has their own idiosyncratic meaning that differs from one to another. So then you might ask, well, is it an empirical question? Is there any way we could evaluate whether some scientist is right and some other scientist is wrong about what the boundaries of theory of mind are? And that is one of the things scientists are fighting about, because they don't want to be using an idiosyncratic term. They want to be using the only right term. And so some people, and then also people get into one-upmanship with terminology, so proposing new terms because they don't like the old terms. So some people say mentalizing or social cognition, and sometimes they mean the same thing, and sometimes they mean a different thing. So one proposal I would make, some of my colleagues in the room won't like this, is that we can submit our vocabulary to the test of whether it does a good job of explaining the brain. Right? The brain is one thing that is in the world, and it's sort of in the world independent of us. And so we can say, well, look, there's a brain region I told you about, the right TPJ, and it responds to some things that are clearly paradigm examples of theory of mind, and it doesn't respond to other things that are clearly paradigm examples of not theory of mind. And so let's use it to draw the boundary. Whatever it likes, that is theory of mind. Whatever it doesn't like, that isn't theory of mind. Okay, so that's one possible answer. But my colleagues would say, no, we decide what theory of mind is. If it turns out there's some things that are theory of mind the right TPJ doesn't like, or some things that aren't theory of mind the right TPJ does like, then it turns out the right TPJ doesn't do theory of mind. Okay, so I'm still on the former side, but you can see why there would be a fight about this.
What a wonderful fight. Please.
Yeah. I was going to ask a question, but I had to integrate the three presentations in my own mind to put it together. And when you went first, and when you were speaking, before you spoke, so I didn't have your input yet, I kept thinking, she's going to the parietal right brain area. Why isn't she looking at the prefrontal, where right and wrong, empathy, and they're not measuring? Why aren't you measuring that? You never mentioned it. And so this was bugging me. So I was going to ask you that, but I couldn't ask the question. Okay, then we went through you, and then we got to him. And now he started to address that to some degree. You get it? So now I'm trying to integrate all this to put my question. Okay, so this was all preface to the question. I believe, I'm using the word believe, I believe that the mind is a function of the brain. The brain is an organ, but without the brain, there is no mind. So you can't just abstractly think of the brain without the connection to the mind. And so, for example, with gay people, I believe, by the way, I'm a secular humanist and I'm straight, but I believe that gay people don't have a choice. It isn't a question of judgment. I believe that it's their brain, which you can then look at which regions are taking up the oxygen, and that there would be a pattern, and that pattern would require them, really, to have the feelings that they have, that it's not a choice. So to me, it's not even morality. It's just natural selection. That is who they are. And if you're religious, which I'm not, then you would say this is the way God put it together. But you get the point? Am I getting the point across or not? Or am I just confused?
Part of the question is about the difference between the roles of RTBJ and the MPFC.
That one I'll take.
Wait, so,
There you go.
I feel like. Oh, I apologize. So your question encompasses a number of different really interesting issues, but one that I find especially exciting is the very beginning of the question where you're talking about this distinction between RTBJ, the right temporal parietal junction, and MPFC, the medial prefrontal cortex. And both of them play really important roles in theory of mind, but not the same role. So.
Yeah, so. Right. So before there was fMRI, people thought that all of empathy and theory of mind and et cetera was going to be in the frontal lobe. And it turns out that it's both. So there's both key regions in the frontal lobe that play really important roles in empathy and theory of mind and thinking about other people, and also the TPJ. The TPJ was the surprise that fMRI gave us. In all the studies that I do, we always study the prefrontal cortex also. So we are always looking at both. I got 20 minutes.
We've got other questions, so we should probably, if we can. Yeah, Katie.
Thank you. I have a question for Laurie about the alter-centric interference, which you described as a glitch. And I just wanted to hear more about that because it seems like in both of the experiments, I think there's kind of a rational explanation for taking that into account. So in the dot experiment, in general, it seems beneficial when we take other people's views on board. And in the clear box experiment, it generally seems good when you're a child to defer to an adult when you're trying to learn a new skill. So I was just wondering, do you mean like literally evolutionarily, or in what sense?
Yeah, so I think part of describing it as a glitch is just to kind of be a little flamboyant in the talk, right? And to get people thinking about, well, why would we be making these errors? Technically in the task it's a glitch because your task is to tell me the number of dots that you see. You're supposed to be shutting off what other representation you have of this other person. So for what I told you to do, you're making errors and you're slower than you should be. Whether or not it's a good thing evolutionarily, though, is a completely different question. And my guess is it's probably a fantastic thing, right? It's the kind of thing that allows us to like stand on the shoulder of giants and not have to learn everything ourselves. It's probably the only reason that we have the kind of cumulative culture that we have this sort of pedagogy and social learning that we have. It was probably a fantastic invention. But it's worth also recognizing, I think, representationally what the glitch is that these two representations are there and we have to keep them separate. And there might be these interesting cases where we don't. And so that's what we're kind of excited about is like, what are the boundary conditions of where we mess up? And can that tell us something about how teaching works, how social influence works? We're particularly interested these days in whose representations do you get more messed up by? My grad student Lindsay has some new data suggesting that you show more alter-centric interference for people that you are more similar to. So if you ask white participants, you see white participants showing alter-centric interference for a white avatar more than they show it for, say, an African-American avatar, right? And so the key is like understanding these glitches is gonna tell us something about how and when we automatically end up taking other people's perspective and when we don't. And so, yeah, but describing it as a glitch, describing it as an error is partly meant to be flamboyant to get us to think what it might be used for.
Where I think to my work understanding the glitches here, were the children told to work rapidly?
Yep. And so there's been now a bunch of different studies on the kids in particular, where folks had that same intuition, where it's like, do kids really know that they're supposed to do it fast? Do kids really know that they can do their other solution? And Derek Lyons, who's the grad student you see in the video, has done some really elegant follow-ups. And one that he did was to convince the child that there was some emergency, they had to kind of solve this as quickly as possible. The other thing he did, which might be relevant in these scenarios, wasn't true in this one, is that he actually left the room and convinced the child they're not even in an experiment anymore, they're just kind of messing around with the box to mess around on their own. And what he finds is that even in those cases, you still see this over-imitation crop in. So it's not merely just that they kind of are just leisurely doing it or they think they're supposed to do it that way. Under his view, there seems to be some changes to how the kid's really thinking the box works. It's like a change in their causal understanding of the box.
Please.
Thanks very much for all your talk about the development. It strikes me that what theory of mind allows us to be able to do is to predict other people's behaviors. That's at the end of the day. That's fair. I don't know. But my question is, do we have to say that we understand other people's representational states, or is it possible that we can somehow deduce what other people are going to do, through the more basic like awareness? I think one of the awareness things. Can we put it together without having to postulate that we have representations of representations?
Yeah, so I mean, this gets back to this question that we had earlier of what's theory of mind, right? My guess is that all of the ways we do this are kind of part of our larger theory of mind, right? The fact that I can kind of just reason things about your posture and your emotions, like from the facts on the ground, is going to be an important part of theory of mind, right? All the awareness stuff that I do, that I'm probably quickly and automatically processing where you're looking, and that's relevant to what I'm saying and what you think about it, right? All of those things are going to be really important parts of theory of mind. But the thing that's kind of weird that humans do that other animals seem not to is to kind of go beyond the facts of the world to postulate something else. They can do a possible world. My guess is that that's not a difference that's merely an issue for theory of mind. My guess is that's a broader thing that other animals can't do in general, is that they can't think about states of the world that aren't states of the world that are here in the here and now. Like they probably can't do counterfactuals. They probably can't think richly about future states. They probably can't think richly about past states. They're kind of bound to the here and now, like what the facts of the world are. But that gives them this limit of one aspect of their theory of mind where they can't truly take a different perspective than their own. And that has interesting kind of problems for their social cognition. It means they, for example, can't solve a false belief test. It means that they probably can't understand Romeo and Juliet. They probably can't think through moral judgments that really require understanding that the person didn't mean to do it or they didn't know something and so on. And so it's probably not a problem of their theory of mind per se, but it leads to other social cognitive problems, this fact that they can't think about a different world. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm curious, so I love the Romeo and Juliet kind of introduction, but then when it comes to morality, obviously I very often make the moral judgment like as though having someone else's, I know what that person's representations about reality are, so I have that, but then I impose my morality. That is to say, wouldn't it be kind of the necessity, almost like maybe solving the West Orthodox political crisis, to not only impose like the states of the other person, but also just to allow another person to have a different morality, to really say, well, you can have different states and know different things to be true, but you also hold different beliefs about what is actually the good thing in the world, so to really allow a much richer theory of mind, which we seem not to have developed yet.
Take a crack at that. Sounds
You
like
know,
you, Josh.
it does seem like there's a certain degree of individual differences in our ability to understand other people as really thinking differently from ourselves. So some people seem to really be able to understand that other people see things in a really different way from the way that we see things, whereas other people maybe think, well, deep down everyone knows that basically I'm right. And then if you look at this ability to really think of other people as having different moral views from you, then it seems like that ability seems to be predicting in some ways how you view the nature of morality itself. That the more people are capable of seeing, of really opening themselves up to the fact that other people have a different view, the more they seem to be drawn to this idea that there's no fact of the matter, that there actually is no fact as to which of the two views is right. So it seems like it's not that no one can do that thing, but it's also not that everyone can do the thing. It seems like people are differing with the degree to which they can do the kind of thing that you're talking about.
One thing to say is that in talking about the differences between people, we've talked mostly about differences of beliefs of fact, but that's certainly not all the kinds of differences we ever have to negotiate with other people. And another kind of difference is differences of subjective liking, right? So what do you like and what don't you like? And that one's actually slightly easier. So kids earlier on in their life are able to think about the fact that people might like different things from them, and then a little bit later learn that people might not know something that they know, and a little bit later than that learn that they might have false beliefs about simple facts of the matter. And later on than that, start to be able to think about how you might have different interpretations of the same evidence. And that is the first sort of 3 or 4 years of this trajectory, but it probably continues to go on throughout our lives as we continue to come up with different and more complex ways to understand the origins of our differences. But one of the things that I sometimes say to people is, theory of mind is one of its roles in social life is a way of handling the fact that other people don't seem to acknowledge the obvious true facts of the world which are straight in front of them, right? So I might look at all of you and think it's utterly mystifying that you don't recognize what is obviously true and factually right about the world, which art is attractive, which music sounds good, and who to vote for in the election. And in those states, I don't have a lot of moves, right? So I might start by thinking, well, maybe it's just a subjective question. And for some things that's okay, like whether or not you like pizza, we can just be subjective about that. But if it's a question that seems really important, I might not be okay with it. Like Hillary or Donald, I might say that's not a subjective question anymore. So then why do you and I disagree? Well, my next move might be, maybe you're just missing some information. There's information I've seen that you haven't seen. So my move might be to try to tell you some facts. And this is often what people do in this situation. They're like, let me tell you some things you might not know about Hillary and Donald that will help to clarify your factual misunderstanding. That often doesn't work to people's intense frustration. Sometimes they get to, maybe we have a different interpretation of these facts. Let me tell you the correct interpretation of the facts. But much more often you get to the final move, which is you're an idiot, right? Because after subjective differences, difference of fact, difference of interpretation, the last move left is irrational stupidity or a willing blindness. That's the trajectory of interpretations of disagreement, and that is also what theory of mind is for.
I wonder if I might claim the right of the moderator and ask a question from left field here a little bit. When the problem of other minds was brought up in the false belief test, and when Dan Dennett and Gil Harmon brought this up, it was very much a third person. So how do I know what Josh is thinking? And one of the things that's worried me, and maybe it's an unnecessary worry, so I'd like to be reassured. I just worry that maybe we've started at the wrong place, that the fundamental relation isn't a third-person relation, but a sort of two-person relation, where what's going on is not I'm trying to understand you, but there's a sort of mutual interrelation that's going, and that the most basic thing is actually the second person or something like that, not the third person. And the second person would, of course, explain some of the ultracentric material. And I'm also wondering, I have no idea how to test this, but I'm wondering whether when the person's in the tube getting the story, that can seem like it's just that person, that it's not an interaction. But my sense is that when you're hearing a story, it's like someone is telling you a story. That's the most basic thing. And so what's really going on isn't my interpretation of what's going on, but somehow a mutual accommodation that's the most fundamental relation. I have absolutely no idea how to test that, but I just wondered whether anyone had thought of doing a complete switch, because you can get started on a research tradition, and since I sort of feel the blame here might lie in philosophy, that we were worried about other minds, and there were 9,000 terrible articles about other minds, and you could never prove it if you had Cartesian certainty or whatever. We might just be starting in the wrong place, and so I didn't know whether there's anything that's being done about that, about just it being a second person, not a third person, and so mutual.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is exactly where you're going, but there has been a long-standing question in the comparative literature about the extent to which non-human animals also share the motivation to do that sort of second person, like a joint attention, sort of jointly representing things.
Thinking of that,
And so one of the most striking things, and everybody in the room who is a young child will know this, of development is like when your kid wants to represent the same things as you, right? So kids start pointing and sharing information just for sharing information's sake, right? What you find is that sort of thing, and if you hang out with primates, it's kind of striking, is just kind of absent in other non-human primates. Mike Tomasello, the comparative psychologist, talks a lot about this, that they just don't really have a motivation to share information. And in particular, it's striking in that they, particularly in apes and other chimpanzees, you see things like pointing, like so things that look kind of indicative, but it seems often very imperative in what they use it for. So apes will have a point that they call a directed scratch, which is basically like if I wanted Josh to groom me over here, I would like do this to Josh, but it's not like I'm trying to share information with Josh, I'm just trying to get something out of him. And so the striking thing is that humans seem to have this move where we want to share information just for information's sake. We want our representations to get into other people's heads. And that the fact that we want to do that might come out of a basic ability to realize that other people might have content that we don't have. Other people don't have the content that we have. So kind of which came first might be this interesting chicken and egg problem, right? If you're a species that can't realize somebody else has a different perspective than you fundamentally, you might just not be that motivated to do anything about it because you don't realize it's an issue, right? The flip side is if you're also a species that just lacks this motivation for whatever reason, maybe you just never have to develop the machinery to represent something like that. And so on the comparative side, this is something that folks have talked about, and it seems like a striking difference with like really early development in humans where the stuff this motivation just plops out to some interesting extent. And it's kind of it's really striking when you're watching, Mike Tomasello shows this fantastic video of chimpanzee group eating together and a human family eating together. And the human family eating together is doing what you expect human families to do, which is I'm showing you stuff, we're talking about our day, we're just sharing all this stuff, paying attention to cultural norms and so on. The chimpanzee group is like everybody's just separate and they're all just like eating. Like it's just like very, very different in terms of the second person types of sharing.
Sorry,
I definitely think that the false belief task has done at least as much harm as good in psychology, so I'm happy to give you the blame if you want it.
Happy to take it.
But not for drawing our attention to a third-person problem. I think the third-person problem turns out to be among the relevant problems. I think that there are lots of true third-person contexts in human social life, that a lot of what we do is gossip about people who are not present, and that's intended to teach lessons about the mind and about morality. What I think is the harm done is the obsession with false beliefs, which arise very rarely and are actually not that important in our thinking about one another's minds. Lots of other kinds of disagreement are more important and more common, and in particular, the false belief task has given us an obsession with 3 to 5-year-olds, as if that was the only time in our lives we ever got better at social interaction, and so finding anything that isn't about that is treated as if it were not about theory of mind. This is one of the contexts where I would like to allow the structure of the natural world to tell us what the right concepts are, and the structure of the natural world tells us there's nothing particularly special about false beliefs. Thinking about beliefs or any other aspect of another person's mind, that's all theory of mind.
So let me say one more thing. So one of the things I was thinking about was just the mutuality of it. That's the danger, that you're thinking, I need to understand what's going on in your mind. Whereas a lot of doing this together is, think about paddling a canoe or something, I see how fast you're paddling, I slow down, I pick up, I do whatever, that we need to cooperate and work together. And so, and I also am thinking of the young children kind of case where you understand, even though you've already read Farewell to Shady Glade 87 times, your kid wants to hear it again. And it's not because you're getting any information, but there's a sort of mutual sharingness of it. And, even when he doesn't ask to hear it again, you just realize he's looking back at the beginning of it. And so this kind of mutual adjustment, I wonder, isn't a better way than just, I need to figure out what you're thinking. I don't need to do that so much as I do need to work
This
with
is
you.
the wrong question.
Is it wrong?
Yes. I mean, if you're asking what is the most fundamental, most interesting part of human life, the answer might not be theory of mind, so it's not theory of mind. Okay, right? If we could do tons of our social living without theory of mind, I mean, ants do, right? You could do tons of social living without theory of mind, and we do. We rule our social lives with lots of our cognitive and social capacities. The fact that we can time our mutual canoe paddles to within millisecond precision is critical for canoeing, but it doesn't depend on theory of mind. And how critical it is irrelevant to whether or not it's theory of mind.
Yeah, that's a little bit what I was saying, that maybe I want to maybe expand theory of mind to second person.
Okay, but I'm just going to say let's
not
not.
say-
Let's say, here's a cool set of things we do. We coordinate actions. And the reason why I want to say that is that coordinating actions has a totally different cognitive and neural profile. It depends on different brain regions. It's good and bad at different things. We share it with different other species. It's just a completely different problem in the natural sciences, which is why I started by saying, if you're going to ask me what's theory of mind, I'm going to say, we don't get to just decide first.
Yeah, no,
we have to
fair enough.
look at how it happens, which animals do it and how they do it, and what brain parts they do it with, and what errors it makes, and that will tell us, is this part of the same system or part of a different system?
If I might suggest a kind of like kumbaya. So I feel like maybe there are just different notions of fundamentality, where depending on which notion of fundamentality you have in mind, you could think different thoughts about which of these two things is more fundamental. So one notion of fundamentality you might have is, if you ignore all other species and just think about human beings, you might ask the question, which is the most important aspects of our lives? Is the most important aspect of our life our ability to outwit others by figuring out what they're doing and then predict their action? Or is our aspect, the most important thing about our lives, our ability to interact with others in these mutualistic ways? And then I think you'd say it's the second. And then it's
Josh, I just totally don't recognize this question. Which is the most important thing? Like, is vision more important than motor control? That just doesn't make any sense from a natural science perspective. Defining a domain is not about claiming importance.
But let me give you your side of the kumbaya, and then maybe you'll appreciate it. So then I was thinking that maybe the issue that sense of importance, or like what really makes life worth living or something, is really separate from this purely scientific question. The purely scientific question of which of these things sort of shaped our capacity for a theory of mind. So why is theory of mind the way it is and not some other way? Why do we have the ability to understand people's minds in certain ways and not other ways? And there I think you see in these other species that this ability to figure out what people think other conspecifics know versus are ignorant of is used almost exclusively in the competitive context as an ability that used to outwit other conspecifics. So even though we might be using it now in our lives in this very mutualistic way, if you want to understand why it works this way and not some other way, you don't want to be thinking of this distinction between knowledge and ignorance in terms of the role that it plays in our lives right now, but in terms of this role that it played in evolution, which is mostly in the competitive context, not the one that's playing right now. So that the kumbaya that Rebecca rejected was there's a distinction between this kind of sense of fundamentality that has to do with sort of making a kind of value judgment about which aspects of our lives make life worth living, and the purely scientific question of which aspects of our lives explain the processes that we now observe in theory of mind. And then we may say different things about those different ones. Maybe you still reject my
I think you'll have to continue that discussion over wine and cheese. We're unfortunately out of time, but I would like to invite you all to take part in the reception, but then also join us again on November 28th. But before we do that, let's thank all of our panelists and our moderators.